Good morning and welcome to China Now, the show that brings you a comprehensive look at today's China and its place in the world. I am Makiza Latifa and we have a dynamic lineup of stories for you today on China Current with Lisa. First, we delve into the latest geopolitical ripple as former President Biden's sanctions against China's drone giants, DJI, an action that has even troubled current President Donald Trump, who was recently inaugurated. What's at stake for US-China relations? Lisa will tell you more shortly. Next will be on space, where China's Long March rocket has successfully launched Pakistani satellites, marking another milestone in international cooperation and China's growing space ambitions. And finally, a record-breaking moment from Shanghai. The city has set a brand new world record and will reveal just what it has done to put it in the global spotlight. Stay tuned for all this and many more on China Now.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on the latest developments in China. I'm Lisa. In this episode, Biden's sanction against China's drone maker DJI troubles Trump. China's rocket launched Pakistani satellites into the space. Shanghai sets a new world record. First, let's start with Trump's big day. On the 20th of January, Trump delivered his inaugural speech indoors at the US Capitol, breaking a long-standing tradition of hosting the ceremony outdoors. This choice typically results in a 60% reduction in live audience size, which is why no US president has opted for this in the past 40 years. So, why would Trump, who is known for his love for the spotlight, make such a decision? CNN suggested it was because of cold weather, but the real reason might be tied to concerns about DJI, the Chinese drone maker. Trump had previously survived 2 assassination attempts, which led the Secret Service to ramp up security for the inauguration. According to NBC, Special Agent Matt McCall, who was in charge of the president's safety that day, noted they were preparing for potential drone threats. Given what we've seen in the Ukraine war, avoiding exposure to the sky is often the safest route when it comes to drones, and it looks like Trump's security team took that to heart. But why wasn't Biden concerned about drone threats during his inauguration? The answer lies in DJI's geofencing technology. Since 2015, after a DJI drone inadvertently entered White House airspace, the company has installed geofencing at the US government's request. This technology uses GPS to prevent drones from flying over restricted areas such as White House, airports, and military bases, effectively preventing drone-related terrorist incidents in the US for years. However, just before Trump's inauguration, on the 13th of January, DJI announced it would unlock its geofencing in the US, replacing non-fly zones with enhanced warning zones. This meant that if a DJI drone flew over restricted areas, the system would only notify the operator, leaving it up to them to decide what to do. Foreign policy raised alarms about this, especially since a month earlier, unidentified drones had caused panic in New Jersey, and FBI was still trying to figure out what happened. For US law enforcement, which doesn't have many ways to counter drones, this change could be a big problem. But really, the US government has to look in the mirror here. Keeping drones out of the restricted airspace is its job, not DJI's. The FAA even admitted that it doesn't require drone manufacturers to include geofencing. Other American companies like Skydio sell drones without this feature, meaning DJI has been voluntarily maintaining a protective geofencing system at its own cost for years. Instead of being thankful for this, the US government added DJI to the list of Chinese military companies in October 2024, slapping on sanctions under the guise of national security threats. Given this treatment, why would DJI want to keep helping the US? It makes sense that they stopped providing geofencing service in the US. According to Politico, the day after DJI removed its geofencing on January 14th, several US intelligence and law enforcement agencies issued a joint warning that Trump's inauguration was a potential target. This was due to over 700,000 users on Telegram threatening to assassinate Trump the day after the election, following a video from a media outlet linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Maybe if Trump hadn't used a drone to take out Soleimani in 2020, he wouldn't have faced such intense security concerns, regardless of DJI's geofencing status. He might have been able to hold his inauguration outdoors instead of staging a tough guy under the Capitol's Iron Dome. Moving on the 17th of January, China's Long March 2D rocket successfully launched Pakistan's PRSCEO-1 satellite into orbit. This is a big win for China's space program and marks the 556th flight of the Long March series. The PRSCEO-1 satellite, developed by Pakistan's space agency, is going to help Pakistan keep a close eye on environmental changes. It will help provide important data that can support sustainable development projects in the country. But China isn't just working with its neighbors. Back in December 2023, the Long March 2C rocket launched the satellite for Egypt. Plus, China has teamed up with Brazil to develop 6 satellites, 2 of which are already in action. These satellites are crucial for monitoring flooding, extreme rainfall, and even deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. Interestingly, while China is making these advancements, SpaceX Starship had a tough day on the same date. It exploded during its 7th test flight, and debris scattered over a wide area, reportedly reaching parts of the Caribbean. This caused some major disruption in air traffic with multiple flight delays and rerouting. There are also environmental worries about this debris, especially since it would impact habitats for endangered species. After another explosion in 2023, debris ended up in crucial nesting areas for endangering piping plovers. Judd Starr, a sustainability scientist at the University of Massachusetts, summed it up well. Musk is a complicated figure. On the one hand, he's played a crucial role in popularizing EV and battery storage with Tesla. On the other, he's flying space tourists on missions that create a huge amount of pollution. Next up, let's move to Shanghai, where over half of Tesla's EVs are made. On the 15th of January, Shanghai released its government work report, and there are some impressive highlights. First off, China's port has hit a major milestone, achieving a container throughput of 51.5 million standard containers. That makes it the first major port in the world to surpass the 50 million marks in a year, and also making the 15th consecutive year that Shanghai port has been recognized as the world's busiest port. Just to put this into perspective, back in 1994, the throughput was only 1 million containers, which means there's been an incredible 50-fold increase in international trade over the 30 years. But it's not just freight that's thriving. The passengers transport sector is also making waves in Shanghai. In 2024, the city's airport recorded over 800,000 flights, with passengers numbers exceeding 124 million, thereby setting a new historical record. And there's more good news on the horizon. Starting in December 2024, the National Immigration Administration of China is relaxing visa-free policies. This means that foreign transit passengers can now stay for up to 10 days without a visa. With all these developments, experts believe Shanghai's airport are set to break even more records in 2025. And that is all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. We look forward to hearing from you and see you next time. And also, Happy Chinese New Year!
And that's all for China Currents with Lisa. Thank you so much, Lisa. Now it's time for the Thinkers Forum, where we dive into the ideas and perspectives shaping the world's understanding of China. John Ross is a senior fellow at the Changyang Institute for Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China, and he believes strongly that the reason that China's economy has slowed down is very simple. The investment has been falling significantly in China. Let's hear from him as he shares his insights on the pivotal development for the first part of the Thinkers Forum. Let's get started.
Well, the challenges, there are external challenges and there are domestic challenges. The external challenge is obviously the attempt by the United States to slow down the Chinese economy, and the fact that is through tariffs and sanctions and so on. And that's the policy by the United States. And the other is that the global North economies are growing very slowly. The United States is growing on average about slightly over 2% a year, and the European economy is growing at 1% a year. So these are objective problems which confront China. Okay. The biggest challenge inside is some confusions created by wrong ideas which exist in Western economics, in which people are trying to persuade China's economy to adopt basically the same structure as the United States. China's economy grows at about 5% a year. The US economy grows at slightly over 2% a year. If China's economy were to adopt the same basic structure as the United States, then it would slow down and grow at 2% a year. Then the United States would be very pleased with the situation, because in that case China would never overtake the US economy. And this is therefore a huge international debate, the most important debate, economic debate in the world, is the attempt of the United States to persuade China to adopt the same economic structure as the United States, in which case China's economy won't grow at 5% a year, it will grow at 2% a year. And this leads to various technical discussions about things like the percentage of consumption and the percentage of investment in GDP. But each of these has very, very big social forces behind it. I mean, if you look at it rather simply, China invests about 40% of GDP and grows at 5% a year. The US economy invests about 20% of GDP and grows at about slightly over 2% a year. Obviously, if China were to reduce its level of investment down to the level of the United States, that's to 20%, well then China's economy would also slow down to 2%. So therefore you have this weird debate whereby people say, look, China's economy doesn't look like the United States, or doesn't look like the Western economy. No, of course it doesn't, because it's more successful. It's growing faster. If the Chinese economy looked like the United States, it would grow at the same, much slower speed than the United States. So it's a sort of bizarre discussion of sort of Western arrogance. They say, China is different to the West, which is absolutely true. Therefore, it must be China which is wrong. But this is ridiculous, because it's the Chinese economy which is growing faster. And therefore, what they should say is, China is different to the West, and it's the West which is less successful. Let me take a comparison, because Goldman Sachs recently produced a report which made exactly this type of argument. Supposing a company went to Goldman Sachs and said, we want to enter a new industry. Goldman Sachs, please come give us some advice. And what Goldman Sachs said, well, look at this is the industry. These are the companies which is most successful, and these are the companies which are less successful. You shouldn't copy the company which is the most successful. You shouldn't learn from the most successful company. You should learn from the less successful companies. Well, everybody would laugh at this just before they cancelled their contract with Goldman Sachs for giving them idiotic advice. But that's exactly what is happening with this Western argument, which is China is growing much faster than the West, or than the United States and Europe. Therefore, they argue that China must adopt the economic structure of the United States and Europe, in which case China will slow down. This is absolutely a bizarre argument. So, but nevertheless, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Economist put out this type of stuff all the time. And therefore, this leads to unfortunately, some people in China copy this nonsense. And therefore, this leads to internal discussion in China. So those are the internal main ideological issues. There are then objective problems which can't be overcome quickly, in which China has the correct policies, but they simply can't be solved quickly. For example, research and development. China has by far the highest level of research and development as a percentage of GDP of any global South country. It's about 2.4% of GDP. It's almost twice that of the second one, which is Turkey. And it's ahead of some of the G7 economies, but it's still behind as a percentage of GDP, the United States, Japan, Germany. And China can't solve this problem quickly because it's not a question of money. the fundamental thing that you need for research and development is you need trained people. And it takes 20 years from somebody entering primary school to coming out the other end with an engineering PhD, which is the type of thing which is you need for research and development. So the increase in China's expenditure on R&D is held back not simply by money. If it was money, it could be solved immediately. It takes a long time to train such people. So these are real objective problems. So we may say there's 3 levels of problem. One is the slow growth of the United States and Europe and its attempts to slow down China. The second is foolish arguments which have no intellectual validity, which are put forward by the West to try to slow down China. And then there are real objective issues, which is due to China's level of development. Only about around 15% of China's population has higher education, compared to 50% in the United States or 70% in South Korea. And it will take a very long time, in that case, decades, to train it. So there's sort of 3 sets of problems. Can they copy? No. Every single country in the world is specific. And therefore, if you copy mechanically another country, you will inevitably be adopting the wrong policy. But can you learn lessons from it? Yeah, the answer to that is yes, you certainly can. And therefore, what is the big lessons for China? You have to have a very high level of investment to grow fast. All the Asian economies which are growing rapidly, and there are, India grows rapidly, South Korea grew rapidly, Indonesia grows rapidly, Vietnam grows rapidly, India grows rapidly. They all have very high level of investment in the economy. Then you also need an open economy. That is, you need to participate in international trade. The attempt to create a self-contained economy won't work properly. Those countries which did it, what used to be called the import substitution strategy, it won't work. You need a high level of research and development. This is where, for example, South Korea is still ahead of China. Japan is still ahead of China. Not because of wrong policies by China, but because it takes a long, long time to train people in, to give them PhDs in engineering or PhDs in science or PhDs in mathematics and things like that, which is what is the really important things for that. So you need high investment, you need an open economy, you need skilled labour, you need high levels of research and development. These are common in all these countries. How they actually combine in each country, that's completely specific. So yes, China's has great lessons for other countries, but it can't be mechanically copied by other countries.
Next on the Thinkers Forum, we are joined by Ron Unz, an American theoretical physicist, a publisher and founder of the Unz Review. Known for his incisive perspectives, Ron will take us beyond the headlines to explore the deeper dynamics of the American economy. He'll examine the growing class divide between the haves and the have-nots, and what these disparities mean for America's future, and perhaps even its global standing in relation to China. Stay with us as we unpack these critical issues with Ron Unz right here on the Thinkers Forum.
One thing that really was a turning point in my perspective was the Iraq War from, about a decade earlier, because, there had been absolutely universal coverage in the American mainstream media that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he was developing nuclear weapons, that he had biological weapons. And it was just unquestioned. In other words, every media outlet had that perspective. And it was just absolutely shocking to discover that none of it was true. And that, many of the key figures in the American government had been aware that it was false. And probably many members of the media had been aware as well. But they still reported complete falsehoods, which, led us to the Iraq War. And the Iraq War was a huge shift in our Middle Eastern policy. It basically has led to now 2 decades of wars in the Middle East, destroyed numerous countries, killed or displaced many, many millions of Middle Easterners, and cost the American public probably something like $7 trillion in spending. So, for a policy of that enormous magnitude to be based entirely on lies, and lies that were universal across our entire mainstream media, just made me very, very suspicious of other things moving forward. So, I mean, basically the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the Iraq War was, a huge turning point in my perspective. And then, as I sort of started looking into other matters, and, the internet at that point was becoming more and more developed. In other words, there were more and more websites and resources available. I began becoming very suspicious of many things in the past as well. Because, if something so dramatic as a decision to go to war against Saddam Hussein, invade Iraq, basically try to occupy the country, could be based on entire misrepresentations, then, I wondered whether things from 40 years ago or 50 years ago or 80 years ago might be distorted in the same way. Well, I mean, that's really sort of nonsense. In other words, the whole thing about it is, when I decided to launch the website, I decided to launch a website that would provide a convenient venue for perspectives that were excluded from the mainstream media. And, perspectives from all across the ideological spectrum. In other words, left wing, right wing, libertarian, those views that simply could not find a place in the mainstream media were very welcome on our website. So, that certainly includes a lot of very right wing individuals, but also includes a lot of very left wing individuals, or people whose views don't really fit into one perspective or the other. In other words, who are sort of off to one side. And the whole thing about it is, as I started, another aspect to my sort of changing viewpoint on these things was around 2000 or 2001. I'd begun a new software project involved in trying to digitize the archives of America's leading intellectual publications of the last 100 or 150 years. In other words, you may have heard, obviously there's the Atlantic Monthly, which is about 200 years old. There's The Nation, The New Republic, Harper's, but there were also many, many dozens of other publications. I mean, probably well over 150 of them that at one time or another were America's leading intellectual magazines. In other words, these were the mainstream, very respectable publications. And I ended up basically just digitizing them and making them available on a website. And as I went through and did the digitization process, every now and then I would look through some of the articles they had or the table of contents, and I gradually discovered that so many of the things in America's past, of 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 150 years ago, were very different than I'd always assumed. In other words, based on my college classes, based on the newspapers and magazines that I read, I'd always had a certain perspective on America's history and Western history. And when you actually read the publications, the leading publications of that era, you gained a very different perspective. And in fact, some of the most influential figures in American intellectual life of 100 years ago had been so totally disappeared and forgotten that I'd never even heard of their names. So it's just a very strange thing when you come across so many hundreds of articles written in these leading American publications by one of America's most prominent intellectual figures, and you'd never heard of the individual. So, things like that made me more and more suspicious of the sort of establishment narrative that I'd really, gained from all the classes I took and all the textbooks I read. So, I mean, the whole thing about it is, as I saw that the past of America was so different than what I really thought it was, I realized that, in the same way that, for example, what I was seeing in the newspapers on a day-to-day basis about the Iraq War, about so many other things nowadays were different. But I mean, that had also been true in the past. So, the whole thing about is when you're talking about, for example, American publications of 60 or 70 years ago, the most establishment, mainstream, respectable publications from then were saying things and writing things that these days would be considered ultra fringe lunacy. So, I mean, even for example, that would apply to the New York Times. In other words, if you look at what the New York Times was writing 50 years ago or 100 years ago, those would be the views that today's New York Times would regard as ultra fringe lunacy. And so, they obviously can't both be correct. In other words, the New York Times of 100 years ago and the New York Times today are saying such different things. They can't both be correct. And, probably neither of them are entirely correct. But I mean, the whole thing about it is, the range of ideological perspectives that are allowed in today's mainstream media is so incredibly narrow compared to what it had been in the past that I just thought it was important to provide a much broader range of ideas, which is basically what I did by, allowing the publication or republication of all of these controversial things from individuals all across the ideological spectrum. So, when you have organizations like the ADL or the SPLC or some of these other groups denouncing what I'm publishing, what they're basically saying is that the only ideas that should be permitted in American mainstream discourse are those considered respectable and acceptable today and not from 20 or 30 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. So, I mean, they basically, and the other funny thing about it is, as I started looking into the past of some of these organizations, for example, the past of the ADL, the views that was founded on were extremely different than I'd been aware of, and probably extremely different than most leaders of the ADL are aware of today. So, it's the sort of thing. What happened in the past is very, very different than what Americans assume was the case. America had been generally on very friendly with terms with China for decades. After, for example, Nixon's opening to China. In other words, we viewed China back then as a counterweight against the Soviet Union. And so China and the United States, in a sense, were quasi-allies in the last stage of the Cold War. And then when the Cold War ended, America stayed, reasonably friendly with China for the years that went forward. I mean, really, China was regarded just as another country in the world. I mean, ideological wars were over. The situation was very different. And then China, as it grew economically, became very important for American corporations. So many of the leading American corporations ended up investing in China, building their products in China, selling their goods in China. I mean, General Motors so earned most of its profits in China. I mean, Apple built most of its iPhones in China, and Chinese bought the iPhone. So, in other words, America had a very close economic relationship with China. And even though in some ways America sometimes was pulling back from China on the political level, on the strategic level, on the military level. I mean, with America's, for example, shift more towards going back on what we'd said towards Taiwan, under the Obama administration, under the Bush administration. I mean, still economically, America was very close to China, but it was really probably about 10 years ago when when many of the American geopolitical figures in DC realized that China's economic growth was continuing and that China basically was on the verge of surpassing America economically in purchasing power parity in terms of the real size of its economy. And it was continuing to grow so rapidly and was not, for example, following the financialization route that America had followed, really following more industrial capitalism, as someone like, for example, Michael Hudson has advocated, rather than financial capitalism. There was a sense that there might be a clash with China down the road. And that's actually when the talk of the Thucydides trap, that there might be an inevitable conflict between a rising China and a reigning United States for geopolitical control over the world. And so at that point, the American media started just being much more hostile towards China. And the way it works is, more and more negative things about China were emphasized every year, fewer and fewer positive things. So, for example, most Americans really developed a view of the Chinese economy having all sorts of problems, doing very badly. In other words, I would bet if you asked most Americans, even most well-educated Americans, whether the American economy or the Western economy as a whole or the Chinese economy was growing more rapidly, they would all agree that the American economy in the West was growing more rapidly than China, even though the truth is exactly on the other side. In other words, again, American media outlets, to some extent, follow a propaganda line. and they've become more and more propagandistic over the last 10 or 20 years. I mean, it's really getting so that you can't trust almost anything you see in the New York Times or even the Wall Street Journal or these other leading publications. They're just not as reliable as they used to be sometimes in the past. And so by playing up all sorts of negative things towards China, they really caused more and more Americans to develop hostility toward China. And since America's media dominates the entire world, it's the global media, that obviously caused much more hostility towards China, not only among American allies, the Western countries that are in the America bloc, but also many third world countries as well. And that obviously was accentuated during, the COVID outbreak because America, very falsely blamed COVID on China, claimed that it had leaked out of a Chinese lab, that it might be a Chinese bioweapon. And because America dominates the world of propaganda, those propagandistic tools did a lot of damage to Chinese reputation around the world. And, that takes a while, obviously, to recover. And it certainly injured America. It injured China's reputation tremendously among the ordinary American public. Because, I mean, the truth is, China coped extremely well with the sudden outbreak of COVID. I mean, probably better than almost any country in the world. I mean, lockdowns were very unpopular, but until Omicron came along, they were successful in stamping out the virus. While America had really the worst of both possible worlds because we had the highest death rate of any developed country in the world, higher than any of the European countries, and we had a year or two of continuing lockdowns. So while ordinary Chinese were going about their business in a very normal sort of way, Americans were confined to their homes for a year or even 2 years, with the intermittent lockdowns being both very ineffective and also very problematic for ordinary American daily life. So many of our businesses went under. So much of our economy was really severely damaged by the COVID lockdowns.
And for the final phase of the Thinkers Forum, we turn to Professor Keyu Jin, a renowned economist at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Jin will delve into one of China's most pressing challenges, the nation's shift from its singular focus on economic development, once defined by GDP growth as a clear, measurable target, to a more multifaceted approach. What does this evolution mean for China's long-term ambitions and its place in the global economy? Let's hear Professor Keyu Jin's insightful analysis. Please stay with us.
You look at EVs, China became the largest producing EV country and EV patent producing country within 10 years. What China's inherent advantage is, I do think that the state plays a critical role when it comes to new strategic emerging sectors, new sectors which needs a boost, a jumpstart. Who's going to do that? If you wait for the private market to do that, either it'll be too slow or it will not be enough. Private investment will not be enough, and where there are market failures. China's success lies in the mobilization aspect of the state, the coordination, combination of the mayor economy with industrial policy and the private entrepreneurialism have created these new emerging strategic industries that no one else in the world was able to do within a short space of time. Most people think that China is an extremely centralized system, as if all decisions are made from the top down, and that's a misconception. The more accurate way to describe it is political centralization coupled with economic decentralization, where the majority of economic policies, economic decision makings, making economic outcomes are implemented at the very local level. I want to give you an example which really highlights the power of the mayor economy and its uniqueness. Well, first of all, why are mayors or party secretaries or provincial governors and local government officials so motivated to do the right thing for the economy, right? You think that one usually characterizes a country like China without a Western-style democracy as more prone to having a grabbing hand. Instead, the local government officials had a helping hand. I'm actually sitting in China right now, and I'm looking at these companies and how much the local government is coming out to help coordinate between lenders and debtors, between banking system, the companies, setting up shop to attract talent, helping them, they're a one-stop shop to these companies. Why do they have this incentive to offer a lending hand, a helping hand, rather than grabbing hand, as most people think? Well, for a few reasons. One most important reason is that if they do a good job with the local economy, they get promoted. Of course, they have other personal gains, glory, sense of accomplishment, envy from other neighboring competing governors or party secretaries and so forth. But they are motivated, by and large, to do the right thing. And so that's what people don't understand about China, as if the state is always opposing the private. In fact, no, it's the state enabling the private. Yes, certainly there are aspects in which the state crowds out the private sector and the state monopolizes in certain things. But by and large, there's China's rapid economic growth depended greatly on this mayor economy, on this decentralization, where the local governments play a big role. Why? Because they need the local governments. Not everything is mature in this Chinese system. Not always, the rules, the permits, everything, the business environment requires a certain amount of government intervention. But I want to give you an example that I think very strongly illustrates the mayor economy, in addition to the power of industrial policy when it is implemented right. And that is the case of either solar panels or EVs, or many, many other examples, including robotics. So in 2005, if you look at a map of China, if you look at where in the country there were solar patents or productions, it's a desert. It's a desert in 2005. And of course, from 2005, the Chinese government decided to implement industrial policy supporting solar panels, but at the local level, at the city level. Maybe first 4 cities, maybe then 10, rolling out to 20, and then eventually 40, some cities over time, over a stretched period of time, implemented these industrial policies. And then 10 years later, 2015, you look at a map of China and look at solar panel production or solar panel innovation or patents, you see it has blossomed all over China, with the exception of the western central provinces, but really spread over China. And most of these cities had industrial policy implemented at some point. I think these are really incontrovertible examples where this could be very powerful. Now, that said, the mayor economy has its dark sides as well, right? Everything has a cost and a benefit, and one has to decide what the overall outcome is. If you look at the debt levels now at the local government level, the misallocation of resources, the huge capacity of the solar panels, that has a lot to do with the mayor economy, because the incentives is not at demand, on the demand side, consuming, it's on the supply side. The best companies that can become global is the mayor economy's ultimate objective. But I want to clarify that industrial policy is not just subsidy. It is much broader than that. And this is where countries get it wrong, as if you can subsidize a country and a sector to success. It's not the case. It's not about just throwing money at the problem. The local government created many, first of all, a good business environment, but coordinated supply chains. They jump-started a new ecosystem, right? If the government says, look, let's procure this new technology, let's start with SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, they will do that. They'll create that demand. Lots of these local government just make sure that this industry is going to at least have a good environment with the right players involved. A lot of it is mobilization, coordination, and allocation. It's not really just the hard financial policy. It's a lot of the soft policies that matter. And ultimately, whether industrial policies can be successful or not depends on whether they ultimately lead to more competition. In China, all of these industries, EVs, solar panels, or what have you, are experiencing the most ferocious competition within China. It has not created a few winners with huge monopoly powers. That's not what the industrial policy in China have done. They have created ultimately more market competition. And then you withdraw these policies and let the market determine who is the winner. There's a lot of misunderstanding about China, but yes, competition in the Chinese political system is a very important constriction, checks and balance mechanism. Competition at the local level among provinces, even among, regions or cities, create inherent checks and balance on the system. If you think about it this way, if you're a promising company and you go to set up shop in a city, and either that city or that provincial government is not friendly, let's say, or is corrupt or extractive, as many famous economists claim China to be an extractive country, then what do? They simply flock away to the neighboring province or city and contribute to their GDP and their investment and their employment. Ultimately, the local government cares about these three things: GDP and employment, and how much you can contribute to the overall economy. So that would be killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. Now, if you have nowhere to flock because there's no competition, then that becomes a problem. So the local governments often bend over heads over heels for the promising companies. We mentioned about NEO and some others, EV companies. There was huge competition among the local governments who can bid for NEO. In fact, I'm just talking to a startup, not even a startup, an idea that has been very promising. The Beijing government said, look, whatever the Shanghainese government will offer you, we're going to match and we're going to actually increase that. This is not even on something that has already succeeded. What does it mean that local government create this competition creates this constraint of local government behavior? And again, another misunderstanding is that these government officials it's not the case that they have no checks and balances and no monitoring going on. In fact, monitoring surveillance is everywhere. It's even coming from the civil society itself. There's actually a dynamic debate on social media on these things. There are lots of criticisms about local governments. In fact, a Kennedy School study have shown that maybe a third or even more of lots of these social media posts is about monitoring local government officials, right? So there's a lot of actually, I would argue that there's too much monitoring and surveillance going on and not enough on focusing on creating more wealth today. China has thousands of years of history. Actually, China created one of the first modern bureaucracies. There are vestiges of the tradition and the historical elements in the Chinese system, including, the horizontal and the vertical stretches and expansions to every stratum society in every place around the country, and including the relationship, very, very a nuanced relationship between the central and local governments, the emperor, and how it can implement some of his policies at the local level. How can he monitor what's going on in this vast nation? That kind of central local tussle has been a millennial condition that is still very much a part of the feature of the Chinese economy today. And even if you look at the very topical aspects in the Chinese economy, like the local government debt, how to resolve the local government debt, again, it comes back to this very nuanced central local relationship. How much responsibility, how much resources to give the local government, how much monitoring? Are they concerned about moral hazard where the central government bails out the local government? Other local governments will be very unhappy if they behave responsibly because you bailed out the less responsible ones. These are such important features in the thinking that they actually shape the most important economic outcomes of the Chinese situation today. So we have to understand these kind of dynamics to appreciate what is happening in China today. But speaking about history, bureaucracy, these inherited traits of the system, yes, they're very strong, and including its relationship with people, the relations between authority and the Chinese people. The West thinks that it's just the Chinese government and people's relationship today that is sometimes tense because of the supposedly authoritarian nature of certain things, but actually the relationship with authority, that quiet deference, but not blind submission to authority, is not only a permanent feature throughout history, but also a pervasive feature throughout society, whether it's between teacher and student or children and parents. That kind of relationship of authority is something that is very different in China from where it is in the West. And I think that people should just have a much more open-minded view about different perspectives.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of China Now. From sanctions and space launches to thought-provoking discussions on economic growth and class divides, we've covered the stories shaping China and its connections to the world. Thank you for joining me, Makiza Latifa, as we explored these important developments. Don't forget to tune in next Saturday morning at exactly 8 a.m. for more insights, analysis, and stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and let not China be far away from you anymore.